that aim to influence the behavior of a state or country and change policies that threaten international peace and security. But furthermore, we see that sanctions allow one country or multiple countries to distance itself from a country that they view is either committing reprehensible actions in the form of violating international law, or the idea that they are abusing human rights or lack human rights in their country to raise awareness, right? It's to signify a cutoff to allow for the recognition of oppressive behavior within a country, right? Then within this, we see that sanctions are used as methods to shape other countries' economic and political systems, right? But within today's debate, we think that sanctions are particularly targeted at the idea of shifting one country or one state's political system in the idea of shifting from authoritarian regime to the idea flushed with democratic rights, right? Furthermore, we see that because they come in economic, political, or social measures imposed by countries or international organizations in order to create pressure on authoritarian regimes, it's this idea about bias inherent within this, and I will get into this idea later in my speech. Now, first of all, we think that authoritarian regimes are inherently based on submission to authority, characterized by a ruling group, person, or elites. There's limited political pluralism, meaning it doesn't have values of democracy. It often lacks an idea of a constitution, and it has centralized political control with the idea of intolerance, opposition, and human rights abuses. Okay. We see that harms refer to negative outcomes on citizens within authoritarian regimes, like economic hardship for one. We see that good implies achieving the intended goal, either promoting democracy or improving human rights or improving democratic values within said authoritarian state. Right. Now we're going to move on to the burdens of proof for today's debate. We see that we as an opposition are going to prove to you three main things. We're going to prove how sanctions as a whole leverage on human suffering as a tool for change, meaning that they affect the citizens first and the regime last, which often results in the regime not actually being affected as well. Second of all, we're going to prove how sanctions are used as tools for geopolitical power influenced by bias. Right? Then third of all, under this, we're going to prove how long-term effects outweigh the short-term benefits. Long-term effects being the economic repercussions, the economic vulnerability, as well as the suffering of the citizens. The short-term benefits being this idea of either overthrowing the regime, bringing democratic values, freedom, or political pluralism. Right? We think that side of opposition needs to come up here and they need to prove to us two main things. Right? They need to come up here and prove that how the overthrowing of the authoritarian regime or the change of political and economic system is worth the humanitarian impact, meaning the suffering of civilians of the authoritarian regime. Second of all, they need to come up here and prove how sanctions are not geopolitical tools of influence and bias. Right? And we think that in today's debate, the way we will measure this debate, the yardstick is which side best prioritizes the humanitarian impact or which side best considers the humanitarian impact of sanctions, and that is how it's defined. Then we think that this house within today's debate, for us as side opposition, is defined as the citizens within the authoritarian regimes themselves. The reasoning is the idea that they are influenced most by sanctions, and because of this, they are often the ones who experience the backlash and the consequences of the sanctions first, right? So they have the most to say that sanctions bring more harm than good within today's debate, right? We think that because of this, sanctions hurt people their mental health, right? We see that the poor will always be the last priority within an authoritarian regime when they are facing risks, right? Within an economic crisis, which is often what follows after sanctions are in place, we see that the ruling elite are going to dive out whatever they can to in order to stay in power, because that is one of the main characteristics of an authoritarian regime. In order to remain in power, in order to keep power centralized within themselves, right? And because of this, the ruling elite will take the first pick at available resources, and the citizens or the lower class within the authoritarian regimes are often going to be left to suffer, being the humanitarian impact, right? Now, when we're looking at the context of today's debate, we think that the historical context of sanctions as tools of power is simply that Western nations have historically used sanctions as a manner to impose their values, their alignments, their interests, especially within post-colonial eras, when emerging nations challenge Western influence. We think this is important for today's debate because it shows us how sanctions are not simply to bring peace, but to actually influence other states and countries to carry out a specific agenda, which then means that it doesn't actually bring this idea of peace or democracy or exposure of abuses of human rights and all of these things. Yeah. A clear example of this is within sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s after the Gulf War. Right? You see, were imposed not only due to Iraq's actions of the human rights violations, but also due to its defiance of Western powers within the region. So we see that Western powers saw a nation which they thought were beneath them, defying their regime, defying their values, and they thought the best way to then influence them is to then put sanctions to limit their power, to make sure that they retreat back under Western influence. We see that this disproportionately affected civilians while leaving regimes or structures urgent. The implication of this is that it shows how sanctions serve to maintain or reinforce Western dominance by weakening countries that resist Western influence, right? We think that within the status quo, we can divide sanctions into the idea of the effect it has and the idea of the humanitarian impact, right? We see that the humanitarian impact is largely what today's TV will be based on, right? And we see that within today's debate, it is important to note the idea that within status quo, countries who have sanctions, citizens' livelihood within those countries are often harmed due to decrease in economic activity, which results in humanitarian effects. But not only on that, right? We see that within status quo, there's multiple examples wherein Russia, a country who has faced 16,000 sanctions, was isolated economically and was forced to create foster independent economies within, wasn't actually allowed to succeed, even though this idea of sanctions is seen as a repercussion. The reason we say this within today's debate, and the reason it is studied as something important, is because even after 16,000 sanctions, even after multiple international countries and franchises left, they were allowed to succeed because they fostered their own growth, and this actually allowed them to gain independence, which actually furthered them from being dependent on other states, which just allowed them to, the authoritarian regime within Russia to grow and having a strong power within the country. We think because of this, it doesn't actually harm the authoritarian regime, but it strengthens the power that it has within that country. Before I move on, anything else?
Yeah, what do you think is the current state of individuals or civilians within countries that are under authoritarian regimes?
Okay, that's a brilliant question, and the reason we love to engage with this fact is because obviously as side opposition, they're trying to bring up the fact that already within the authoritarian regimes, they're facing human rights violations, they're most likely being oppressed, they don't have any democracy. And we can this, and we see that it's actually quite significant for them to bring recognition to this. But we think it's not valued within today's debate at the point in which something like sanctions actually worsens this, it actually results in the authoritarian regime influence, the authoritarian regime putting their power or strengthening the control over the citizens, often resulting in the exacerbation of the humanitarian or the human rights violations, which then just leaves the citizens in a worse place than they originally were, when sanctions at the end of the day are meant to help them. That's why we think that the way that you're trying to go about this debate is already flawed, right? Now, when we're looking at this debate, we think that there are two key ideas, right? We think that authoritarian regimes need to be seen as oppressive and aggressive, right? We think that within this debate, there's two keys. Our key principle being technology, and then this idea of the humanitarian impact as well as the geopolitical tool like sanctions. So simply within today's debate, we see that the humanitarian impact, right, is simply the moment sanctions are imposed, it creates a limited access to basic necessities such as food as basic. This leads to the suffering of the citizens within the authoritarian regime, which then leads to the idea that they're often already worse in a worse place than they already want to be, right? Now, because of this, then we're left in a place whereby there's unemployment, which then harms the livelihood within the regime, and also leads to the idea that that they no longer can survive in the place they are, right? We see that because of it, that goes against the idea of geopolity and maintenance related to it. Simply saying that we need to do less harm, release harm, and sanctions do not go about that. They actually cause more harm than anything else.
In things like in things like the Olympics games, in things like the World Cup, we think that largely credits them on points that they harm citizens. That we think that at the end of the day, citizens were harmed, we actually believe. But then look at the status quo currently. We think that citizens in South Africa are the most developed. That proves to you that the point that you make, that sanctions affect citizens first and regimes last, is actually at the end of the day not making sense. Which will prove to you that in our characterization of South Africa's regime, it shows you that, look, sanctions at the end of the day are going to go ahead and cause short-term impacts to citizens that at the end of the day have a lot of long-term impacts that are going to help to change regimes at the end of the day and remove the harm that already authoritarian regimes cause within the government or within civilians. Now, secondly, they talk about the the long-term effects outweigh the short-term benefits, which already proved in my previous characterization as something that does not make sense. And another thing they come to tell us that, look, we want you to prove that the worth of the impact of citizens is worth the change of policies. We think that actually, even that very characterization shows you that, look, the worth the harm that citizens took in, or the humanitarian damage that was caused to citizens, is worth enough to show you the current status quo of South Africa at the end of the day. Now, to come on three things that we want to argue in this debate. One, we think that as a formative.
So do you agree to the fact that sanctions often exacerbate the abuse of civilians within the country?
Thank you so much. I think that sanctions reduce on the harm and completely end it that is already managed within authoritarian regimes. That is simply what I think. Now, I think that what we are basing on as negative are three things. One, that sanctions target remind governments of the the principle of governance they hold, but 2, the sanctions deter authoritarian aggression, and 3, sanctions encourage compliance and strengthen global solidarity. Now, to come to explain for you these arguments, first, when you talk about sanctions that are targeted to remind governments of the principle of governance they hold, and not like individuals are sanctioned and entities within governments. Too often, that looks like things like asset freezes, travel bans on high-ranking officials to remind them of the role they hold. We must notice that the legitimacy of who has the moral and legal obligation in countries to cause change in cities or in the country, that must be affected first. So at the end of the day, we think that sanctions already go ahead and affect individuals and governments that have the contract theory within citizens, that they have that moral authority to protect them and protect their rights. That looks like they have that right or the moral obligation to protect citizens. So that looks like when you ban you ban the movement of the president of Syria, and the end of the day he's going to recognize that, look, I have got the moral obligation to protect citizens, and at the end of the day, since he values his movement, he's going to comply to international standards at the end of the day, and we think that that is what we are looking for, that removes a lot of authoritarian regimes and destroys them at the end of the day. But we need to look at things that have happened of recent. We think that the President Assad of Syria has left the country and run away to Russia simply because of sanctions. And that has already put ahead that, look, the rebel forces have gotten that moral authority to come and take over power and promise to bring a lot of peace within Syria. And that already shows you that actually sanctions are progressive. Now, we intended that sanctions deter authoritarian aggression in 2 kinds of ways. We want to take a study on Russia. Russia, in 2014, actually was sanctioned following its annexion of Crimea, disrupting its economy, that proved that that authoritarian regimes have got a lot of costs lost because of sanctions. That is proven because actually following those sanctions, we see that actually Russia lost 6.4% of its GDP at the end of the day. This, first of all, you can see Russia at the end of the day and helps you to comply to international standards, but 2, it also goes ahead and shows other countries that are interested in actually acting in the same way, that actually being authoritarian at the end of the day is actually having a lot of costs. But 3, we look at sanctions encouraging compliance and strengthening global solidarity and moral imperative. We look at 2 major things. We look at sanctions in Sudan. We think that there was a lot of conflict between Sudan and South Sudan at the end of the day. But what happens then? We think that sanctions were put on Sudan for actually abusing rights of people of South Sudan. What happens is that then South Sudan recognizes the issue of going ahead to actually sign the comprehensive peace agreement in 2005, which led to the independence of South Sudan, limiting the intensity of conflicts and also avoiding war. So we think that largely what we show in our debate is that, look, when sanctions are imposed, in the first place, they actually go ahead and cause a lot of costs. When we look at things like travel bans, when we look at things that are trade embargoes, these are go ahead and show that what the points they bring in their debate that, look, you are giving countries independence of acting to be independent out of the others and grow at the end of the day. We look at the end of the day that these countries are going to go ahead and create things like black markets, go ahead and create things that are not actually going to be having a lot of individuals participating in trade, and that loses a lot of money from their economy. That at the end of the day makes them go ahead and be able to comply to international standards. We think that a major problem as to why we think that sanctions are very important is that, look, these authoritarian regimes, that looks like they're not able to sit down and agree in terms of democracy, in terms of actually discussions, or actually having diplomatic relations at the end of the day. That means that they believe that they are the strongest countries at the end of the day. So the only way to actually force them to agree and sign agreements is going ahead to sanction them and harm them, so they actually go ahead and believe. And we prove to you that even when the harm actually appears, it is a short-term impact on citizens that holds a lot of long-term benefits. But also, there is humanitarian aid of civil society organizations that helps these citizens during the sanction.
Actors analysis, mixed with some positive matter, and then moving on to Wales. Starting off with rebuttal, we would like to say that we believe that opposition doesn't fully understand what an authoritarian regime is, and they aren't interacting with it the way that we defined within our first speaker. Authoritarian regimes lack a constitution, they aim to harm their citizens some of the other things you say. You have given us lots of examples where sanctions have worked in your world, but the thing is, with those sanctions, they didn't actually aim to change the authoritarian regimes. They, a lot of countries still, even after all these sanctions, are still under authoritarian regimes' control and power. For example, in South Africa as well, South Africa technically wasn't considered an authoritarian regime, and then also looking at another example of Russia, while they still have so many sanctions, it hasn't worked, and Russia is still considered an authoritarian regime with a localized power. Okay, moving on to my positive matter, we have identified 3 main points. I'll be starting with the economics and the spillover effect that it has. Sanctions harm the citizens first before they can reach the authoritarian regimes. This looks like authoritarian regimes shifting the pressure from the sanctions onto the citizens and making it harder for them. This means cost of living goes up, this means trades become more expensive, and essentially the life of a citizen in an authoritarian regime becomes worse when sanctions are imposed. This also allows, sanctions affect countries surrounding the sanctioned country and also like allied countries when it comes to trade specifically. When sanctions are imposed, it makes producing things harder, it makes trading with other countries harder, and this means that in those countries who are not under authoritarian regimes, who are completely separate and aren't involved in whatever conflict it is, they also experience problems and hardships. So things like, for example, with all the sanctions imposed on Russia, it makes oil more expensive, which means, like, even for us as South Africa, we have to pay more for things like petrol and all of that. Okay, moving on to the morality and humanitarian aspects. Sanctioned countries use sanctions as a way to demonize the countries that are imposing sanctions, and because of this, it just allows the authoritarian regimes to, it allows authoritarian regimes to maintain power and manipulate these sanctions. So this looks like, instead of the citizens of the citizens of the country under an authoritarian regime seeing all the problems that are wrong with the government uses that as an opportunity to say, hey, look at the rest of the world, look at what they're doing to us, they're making our lives harder, we're just here to protect you and all of that. When it comes to this as well, we can see that sanctions on countries cause them to develop internally, which some may see as an advantage, but it actually isn't. It causes deeper problems. It allows these countries to uplift their own economies and become more independent. When large companies pull out of sanctioned countries, it just lets the country build up its own economy and build up its own kind of independence and nationalized companies that help the authoritarian regimes remain in power. Moving on then to the third point of my semester, the geopolitical powers, which my first speaker briefly touched on. Sanctions frequently are utilized by Western countries to help push their own agendas and do what's and push their own ideals. We can see this in countries like and it seems like these kind of Western countries I'm talking about are like the United States, European Union, and all of that, and the United Nations. They use this as a way to put pressure on these states in act conflict to push the Western political priorities. These sanctions are motivated by a desire to influence the international relations, so things like trade and all of that, and uphold the global norms centered around the West. This also, because of the way that geopolitical power, the way that sanctions are used as a geopolitical tool, it means that sanctions in countries where there should be sanctions are ignored, and they are rather put in places where the West and sanctioned countries want influence and they want power and all of that, and this ignores the transgressions of other regions. For this reason, we think that sanctions as a whole become harmful. That's it. Thank you.
Authoritarian regimes in Johannesburg. We'd like to come and prove to you why actually we, the opposition side, as our stand, we say that these sanctions and these authoritarian regimes have actually done more good than harm. Counter from what the affirmative side is saying. One, I would like to first come and start with what the former speakers have said from the affirmative side. One, from the first speaker, they came and defined sanctions as tools that are used to influence a state or a country. Now, we do not disagree with this argument because we actually believe this is the main reason as why sanctions are actually imposed on countries or states, and for various reasons. So they come and talk about these authoritarian regimes and they characterize them as actually regimes that violate human rights, that abuse human rights, which we do not believe because we actually, as we said earlier, we said that these regimes initially are the ones that cause suffering to these civilians. That's why actually sanctions are imposed on these regimes. Why? To actually subordinate the regime's behavior and actually change their behavior in these states where they are. And then the second one talked about there are three main arguments. One, which was human suffering. Two, this is about that they can be used as tools for geopolitical power. And three, they talked about long-term effects. I will not take you. So now when they talk about human suffering, they say that actually the civilians under these authoritarian regimes are the ones that actually suffer most. But from the first speaker to the second speaker, one, they did not give us clear examples of how these civilians actually suffer in these regimes. They did not give us clear statistics of how many of these civilians have actually suffered. They come and give us an example of Iraq in the 1990s, but they did not give enough evidence to actually support their example. They did not even give us the website where they got this information from. So actually that is very invalid. Two, let's come and talk about how Russia, with the 16,000 sanctions that have been imposed on it, is still actually under an authoritarian regime. We actually believe that the mere fact that Russia has actually lost 6.4% of its GDP, this is enough to put it in a situation whereby it's going to come down and also come to a level of negotiation and international law compliance. Because we believe Russia was kicked. According to the United Nations, Russia was kicked out of the G8 countries. We know Russia as a powerful country that actually wants to show itself and showcase itself among the G8 countries. The mere fact that it has been kicked out of these G8 countries, it is going to enable it to actually subordinate its ways as the international regime and actually come back to a way where they can actually respect human rights. So I actually believe the example they gave of Russia is not valid. Now, the other women talked about how these are tools for geopolitical power. We as the affirmatives actually believe these are not tools of geopolitical power. Why? Because the regimes, we cannot say that these are tools of geopolitical power. Because as you say, the Western states that impose sanctions on the countries that they wish to because of their own agendas in these countries. We actually believe these US states or the Western countries do this for the better good of the citizens in this country because they actually want to promote human rights, not for their own agendas. You did not actually give us examples of countries where sanctions have been imposed because of the likeness of the Western countries. I take it.
Do you not agree that only countries who have like a stronger development can impose sanctions?
Pardon? I beg your pardon.
Do you not agree that only countries who have a stronger development can impose sanctions?
I actually do not believe that because sanctions are imposed by either the international community or different states. Now, I go back to our arguments where we say that actually these sanctions can help to deter authoritarian aggression. As my first speaker said, that this actually we see it in three different ways. One, this comes down the regimes to a level of negotiation and international law compliance. We're saying a country like Russia, with the sanctions that are being imposed on it, and the affirmative side cannot come and actually say that these sanctions have failed because these sanctions are still there. So you cannot give a conclusion that actually these sanctions have failed. So we actually see that Russia is going to come down to a point. The mere fact that it has lost 6.4% of its GDP, it is not going to allow it to keep going down. It's going to come up and actually comply to international law. Two, we also see it as other regimes that are doing the same are actually going to be reawakened because they have seen the consequences of the actions of other regimes like Russia and the effects of the sanctions. So they're actually going to let go of violating human rights because they believe if they continue doing this, I will not take it. If they continue doing this, they're actually not going to. They're going to also be, the sanctions will actually be imposed on them and they'll face the same consequences. Now we give you examples. We give examples like Syria, the most current example. President Bashar of Syria has actually fallen due to sanctions. His authoritarian regime has actually fallen due to sanctions, and this is the most current news right now. Giving rise to annihilation of unfair regime. As we see, according to the sanctions, the Assad family has been in power for like 50 years now. But then because of these sanctions that have been imposed in Syria of the authoritarian regime, which has now led it to fall, it's actually going to lead to a better democracy in the country because of the different sanctions that were imposed in the regime, like arms embargo, like trade embargo. So we actually see that this is going to be a brighter future for Syria because of the liberal forces that have taken charge in Syria to actually promote better human rights. We also give an example of South Africa, the country that I'm standing in right now. It's holding 25% of the continent's GDP because of the sanctions that were imposed in it during the apartheid policy. The affirmative side come and actually told us that these sanctions that were imposed in South Africa were not because of the authoritarian regime. But they come and tell us that the authoritarian regimes are actually those regimes that violate human rights. As we see in South Africa during apartheid policy, human rights were being violated. So that actually does not deviate from their definition that they gave us. We actually see after these sanctions were imposed in South Africa, according to what the first negative said, it led to the government actually letting go of some of their policies that were harsh to the people. What did this lead to? It led to a better development. That's why South Africa is the second most developed country in Africa, holding 25% of the continent's GDP. Now, let's come and give you an example of Sudan, where my first speaker came and said that the sanctions that were imposed in Sudan led it to signing a comprehensive peace agreement, which actually led it to give independence to South Sudan because of the human rights violation that used to happen in South Sudan. Now, as we speak, Sudan and South Sudan are actually in peace because of the sanctions that were imposed on them. So actually, they do not actually give us any evidence on their side that sanctions have actually failed. We see these sanctions that they talk about in Russia are still ongoing, so they cannot actually say that these sanctions have failed. They also came and give some contradictions in their speech. They came and talked about how sanctions lead to no humanitarian needs for food. We actually do not, but they do not actually characterize for us which of these sanctions actually lead to the loss of humanitarian needs. Are you going to tell me that when you impose a travel ban or asset freezes on an individual in a regime, it's going to affect the food that is actually coming to a country? Then we also came and actually told me that there is humanitarian aid during sanctions in these countries, where the civil society organizations actually help the citizens in these countries by giving them aid. So you cannot actually come and tell us that the sanctions lead to low humanitarian needs in these countries. You also didn't give us actually examples of countries where sanctions have actually failed. You gave examples like South Africa, but it is not valid because I've actually explained to you how the sanctions were actually used in South Africa. And then we also came and talked about compliance with international law, whereby we believe Russia, having lost 6.4 of its GDP, it is going to need it to comply to the international law. We also came and talked about how it reawakens the governments in these countries to actually know their duty and their moral responsibility. It's going to help governments, these regimes, to actually know their moral responsibility of their citizens and how they're actually supposed to care for them and actually protect their rights. Because we believe these sanctions are a more peaceful way of resolving conflicts or this human violation in these different countries. And then they also came and talked about we have also talked about how these sanctions that are being imposed by the Western countries are actually done for the good of the citizens in these countries that are facing this human rights violation. Because we believe by the time sanctions are imposed on a country, it is for the better good of the citizens because of the regimes that are actually that are leading to the human rights violation in these different countries. And then with that, I also beg to submit.
I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. The moment side opposition opts to leverage the suffering and human rights of citizens within these authoritarian regimes in hopes of the gain for a 1 in 3 chance of actually succeeding those sanctionist goals, we don't agree with them on that end, and we think they become worse than the authoritarian regimes they aim to oppress. What to expect in my speech? I'm going to be coming over the strategic flaws made by side opposition throughout their case, mainly with regards to neglecting of matter. I'll then go into my 3 main clashes and integrate them with construction before I do my way up at the end. The main strategic flaw with side opposition the main strategic problem with inside opposition's case today is the fact that they rely continually on examples and they promote effectiveness. Note that this motion states this House believes that sanctions on authoritarian regimes do more harm than good. It means both teams on a comparative value are supposed to compare the values and benefits of sanctions if they existed, sanctions if they didn't exist, and what they mean for those citizens, but also not limited to those citizens outside actors in the world. We mentioned in our second speech how sanctions have spillover effects. No regard for mention of that speech they go on to mention and work within their own world. We tell you how they have geopolitical leverage, and I'll explain that now with the examples that they continually learn and think that those examples are their main case lines. They go on and on and on about how we don't mention examples. They go on and how South Africa is a perfect example of a functioning regime that was now changed to a democratic state, and the citizens are empowered. There are relief programs, there are RDP programs that empower those citizens and ultimately relieve them from them. They don't account for the fact that South Africa was a special case whereby within that country we had homeland systems that automatically dysfunctionalized the country in of itself. That means that like opposition's entire narrative for arguing for the betterment of sanctions based on these examples like South Africa is not really true because it relied on insider resistance in the first place. We tell you that if you're looking at the strength and the way out in terms of sanctions, you ought to look at the strength of the regime within of itself. What does this look like? We think that regimes with weak statuses, for example Venezuela or Cuba, ought to have already even achieved the goals, but even when they do, they have humanitarian impacts. This looks like the trade embargoes, which limited employment within Cuba. This looks like the trade. The trade tariffs with limited employment and increased humanitarian suffering, which also limited access to medication within that area. What we then see then is that they still failed to get rid of the primary goal, and that was to get rid of that localization of power within their regimes, that being Castro, the main front runner of that military coup. What we then see in that example is that even when sanctions harm those citizens within the weakest countries, whereby governments are then forced to pull out funding in regards to retrenching citizens, they still don't initially achieve their goals. For God's sake, we have the example of Iran and the example of Iraq, where the US implemented thousands of sanctions towards those said countries in order to flush out Osama bin Laden, and they did not do so. Instead, what happened was the Iranians suffered significantly, but they don't rally against those citizens, they don't rally against those oppressors. Instead, they confide within their loyalty. We think that on the strategic end side, proposition doesn't understand how authoritarian regimes function of themselves and the loyalty that they impose on the citizens within said country. We think, now I'd like to move on to my first clash, that being humanitarian impacts versus the change within compliance to these authoritarian states. It seems like panels that opposition didn't really miss out on the characterization laid out in my P1 speech. We tell you that authoritarian regimes, when they react to sanctions, they see it as a threat. They retaliate. What does this form of retaliation look like? This looks like disregarding those sanctions as a whole and instead looking to illicit means to sustain the economy. This looks like Russia responding to those same sanctions that they go on about, those same sanctions that we mentioned in our speech, by instead moving over to BRICS and moving away from the gold standard. What does this then look like for the goals of these sanctioning powers within that same question? We ask ourselves this: Russia remains a state even after those 16,000 sanctions imposed on it. The war in Ukraine is still being carried on. Russia in itself has increased its economy by 3.6%, and it has moved away from the gold standard, gaining independence. If you want to stress examples, you ought to link them back to the motion, which you failed to do so. You cannot go on and on about Syria and how the president fled the country, when that same president fled to his allied power, Russia, and was not properly punished or put under severe punishment or reforms for his actions within the resistance. We can't have examples without necessary links to the impacts of the motion. The second clash we have is then the humanitarian impacts and the change of states with regards to human relief. We don't get any engagement from the side of opposition with regards to relief, aside from the fact that sanctions are accompanied with relief programs and they don't necessarily harm these actors in the long run. Again, reference South Africa as their main example, since they aren't able to establish any case without it. We think if you look at South Africa, where yes, it was free through the means of sanctions, its gold reserves plummeted significantly. What happened to those gold reserves within Johannesburg? They were taken away by the same sanctioning powers by the US. And what does South Africa look like? Not only in the internal government, but in the global space. South Africa relies on imports and exports from Western powers, those same Western powers that freed it from its relief. We think that opposition does a good job at trying to establish the fact that we ought to be opposed against authoritarian regimes, but they don't really look into factors such as they don't just affect the citizens within that country, but they also affect the global scheme. As mentioned in my second speaker with regards to the spillover effects, when you have countries impose sanctions on especially big names like Russia, when you have countries impose sanctions on countries whereby they have large resources that the world relies on, such as oil, you have further along spillover effects, and this is essentially where the harm comes in. For example, when sanctions were implemented on Russia within 2020 due to its aggressions on Ukraine, what then happened is it delocalized support from other environments, but the oil prices went up worldwide. We don't think already on the contingent scale of the comparison between way ups in terms of benefits of the country and benefits of the world. They automatically lose that on the term that the fact that they affect global trades and global prices and global exports as a whole. So they already lose on that clash there. We think that secondly, they also neglected to go on to a second clash, which was geopolitical power versus the economics of the country in and of itself. We referenced in our first speaker's speech the fact that sanctions rely on geopolitical power in the sense that they operate from ulterior motives. Now, what does this mean? This means that when the US is sanctioning a country in hopes of restoring its human rights, it aims to get something in return. What does this look like? This looks like Venezuela being relieved from its authoritarian grip years after millions of citizens suffered, and then the US expecting oil returns in the form of that national debt and for the many years to come. This also looks like colonial powers imposing sanctions on authoritarian governments within Africa as a whole, and then expecting returns in the form of repayments, in the form of resources, in the form of coal, in the form of cocoa. Panel, we have to ask ourselves, why in Africa specifically do we have large amounts of these reserves, we have large amounts of these resources, but then they are taken away after we are supposedly free from our oppressors? Why are we arguing why is that opposition arguing for the terms of oppressors or better oppressors in the form of sanctions? We don't think they achieved their goals there with regards to that harm there, because although citizens may be relieved of that authoritarian power, they are still owed their due diligence and their resources are taken away as a whole. Lastly, in terms of my speech, what does the way up look like? As I told you, the comparison that we ought to look at in today's debate is the harms and the goods that they exist. We think that if the ratio of harms on type opposition's bench is significantly more proportional than the goods, such as the rare occasions where the 1 in 3 cases where they remove power, or the rare occasions where they remove economic stability, we don't think they win this debate on the valid basis of expunging examples and simply going about referencing clear-cut examples instead of dealing with the mechanisms that prove those examples in any case.
Actually, looking at the factual table that sanctions are doing more harm than good, however, fail to actually prove to us how these sanctions are failing in their motives. Now, in the first place, they come and define for us an authoritarian regime as a regime that is actually causing harm. It lacks democracy, it lacks any kind of rule of law, and it also actually harms citizens at the end of the day. And then they come and claim that South Africa was an authoritarian regime. But when we go back into history, we realize that this is the situation that was happening in South Africa. There was harm on the citizens. South Africa lacked democracy, and it was harming the citizens at the end of the day. So what does that mean? South Africa qualifies to be an authoritarian regime. And when we see that sanctions that were imposed on South Africa, they actually achieved a lot of regime change, because we see that there is a lot of democracy in South Africa, there is rule of law in South Africa, and there's actually a lot of order and actually compliance with international law. Now, at that point, we believe that South Africa continues to stand as an authoritarian regime that actually gained change after the sanctions were imposed. Now, in this debate, we actually expected team proposition to give us, to add on 3 major points. One is compliance, effect of sanctions on citizens, and the international relations that actually these sanctions promote at the end of the day, which they failed to do. Now, in our case, we already show you that sanctions have actually promoted compliance on the larger end, and we believe that at this point, we do not have any reason to believe that sanctions actually promote more harm than good, but rather believe that they actually promote more good than harm at the end of the day. We cannot consider that at a particular point that citizens are harmed, but when we look at the larger impact of sanctions on actually the citizens' life and actually the citizens' well-being at the end of the day, we believe that we can actually not consider the harms that are caused on them just because sanctions are imposed. But we believe that when we look at the larger impact or the longer-term impact of sanctions, we believe that the small impact of sanctions on citizens can actually be overcome at the end of the day. Now, they come and tell us that sanctions make governments shift their problems to citizens, and at the end of the day, at this point, we see that actually citizens are harmed. But they claim themselves and they talked about the fact that sanctions are actually impacting on the authoritarian regimes. Now, the impact of actually governments shifting their power to the citizens is a short-term impact. But at the end of the day, when these governments actually realize the force and the pressure of sanctions, of course they will lose the strength to continue impacting on the citizens. And what are we going to have at the end of the day? We're going to see that actually there is human rights compliance and international law compliance at the end of the day. This is the long-term impact that they fail to show us at the side of the house. Now, they come and tell us that the regimes protect themselves and blame international communities. But we believe that before these sanctions are
achieve at the end of the day from sanctions? International human rights compliance. So if the sanction is achieving this, from the examples that we have given you, we believe that this argument still doesn't stand. They also have to tell us that actually regimes stress other problems to the civilians, like the high cost of living. But citizens are already seeing what's happening. Now, we believe that there is existence of humanitarian aid at the end of the day. So this is going to continue protecting the citizens from the effects of the authoritarian regime. Now, they don't come and talk about the fact that we come and give you the examples of South Africa, Syria. The regime in Syria actually was collapsed, and like there is change of regime in Syria. Now, this is the point of the of the sanctions at the end of the day. So we don't believe that the fact that citizens are suffering for a shorter term and then are achieving the goal at the end of the day, we believe at that point that sanctions have actually done more good than harm. Now, Israel, they come and talk about the fact that sanctions are having longer-term impact on citizens, but they don't actually come and prove to us at the end of the day. So we don't see any long-term impact of citizens because from the examples that we give you of sanctions that have actually been achieved, we see that citizens have actually benefited more. Now, we clash on two major clash points, just like they come and tell us. One is the long-term impact of sanctions versus the short-term impact of sanctions. From these examples that we give you right from our first speech, we prove to you that sanctions have actually achieved more good than harm. So at the end of the day, what is the good that they have achieved at the end of the day? Because in their first speech, they come and tell us that actually sanctions, the major aim of sanctions is to achieve international human rights compliance at the end of the day. And now from the examples we give you, we see that actually the human rights of these countries that have been sanctioned ones have actually improved at the end of the day. So what does this give us at the end of the day? Is the fact that the aim has been achieved. And number two, the humanitarian impact. They keep on arguing about humanitarian impacts, and at the end of the day, they don't actually show us how actually sanctions are the ones affecting this. Because we see, and in the first speech and second speech, they continue to come and tell us that even before the existence of sanctions, people are suffering in these countries. That means the humanitarian effort actually not working at the end of the day. But we see that after the existence of sanctions, when the humanitarian organizations in these countries realize that they have actually international support and recognition, we're going to see that there is achievement of international, of human rights efforts at the end of the day. So what do we see? That in these countries, they're going to actually continue supporting the fight for human rights in the countries that are being oppressed by authoritarian regimes, and we're going to achieve the success. What is the main goal in this debate? Is to achieve the human rights law compliance and international law compliance. I'll take you.
What do you consider as a sanction being successful?
When a sanction is considered successful is when it achieves its aim. What is the aim of a sanction? International law compliance. So if we give you examples of where actually sanctions have actually achieved international law compliance, that is already a success of a sanction. We do not care if a president fled, but if at the end of the day the regime is changing, that is all we want to see at the end of the day. And if we give you examples that actually prove this point, we do not believe that there is any form of argument that should come about this. Now, dear judge, we told you that South Africa, that had actually been sanctioned for a very long time, was suffering and not because of these authoritarian regimes, which were the foreigners at the end of the day. But then after sanctions, actually there are citizens that they tell us they actually came with a lot of oppression against these sanctions. They were more empowered to actually continue fighting for their rights. After the coming of sanctions, they realized that they had international support and they came up and actually overcame the authoritarian regime at the end of the day. So we believe at a point where the citizens are actually realizing the support from different countries, this is the point where we believe that sanctions have achieved the goal of their imposition at the end of the day. Now, dear judge, we also talk about international relations. They come and tell us that only Western countries are capable of imposing sanctions. But we give you the sanctions against Sudan that were put on by the African Union at the end of the day. These sanctions were not actually influenced by Western Union or Western countries, but they were imposed by a body that is actually responsible for promoting human rights compliance in Africa at the end of the day. So we do not see how the argument of coming and telling us that it's Western countries that promote these sanctions that is working at the end of the day. Because we have seen that South Sudan achieved her independence after African Union sanctioned Sudan against that inhuman acts that were happening there. So at the end of the day, that argument that doesn't stand against it. Now, as I conclude, we stand on the argument that as long as sanctions are achieving the aim at the end of the day, we do not care under what circumstances we are achieving this, because we believe the longer-term impacts of sanctions are actually more positive, are greater, and are more beneficial to the entire population rather than the short-term effect like the economic implications they come and talk about at the end of the day. With this, we beg to submit.
We need to notice that even when human rights are important, some human rights, governments can take the right to take away people's human rights to protect them from other human rights. But when they go to school, they will be killed by rebels. The government has a right to stop people from going to school because they protect them from being killed at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, we think that when we are weighing things, we look at what holds more weight at the end of the day and what does not hold more weight. We think that what team affirmative bases on is something that actually has got less weight at the end of the day, but what we base on is what looks at development of a country, but also freeing it from what actually is hindering it at the end of the day. Basic arguments that come from team affirmative. I think that I'm going to base on examples that they bring at the end of the day and show us that actually the debate is actually relying on examples. We think that examples are very important in this debate to just prove to you the arguments that we talk about. We give you arguments which we think that team affirmative does not attack at the end of the day, but basically rely on our examples, which at the end of the day also they do not prove that if without sanctions, such success would have happened. We think that team affirmative, if they believe that at the end of the day sanctions cause more harm than good, they should have proved to us that without sanctions, we should have got better countries than actually what we have with sanctions. What we get from team affirmative that proof sanctions influence Western agenda. I think within our debate, we show that look, even when it is Western agenda, our aim is to have a lot of compliance to international law. So we think that at the end of the day, if that agenda of the Western is actually taking us to international law compliance, then it is okay, because at the end of the day, it does not abuse human rights. So would we rather have actually people being killed at the end of the day, or actually have people actually go to Western agenda, because that Western agenda then shows you that people are complying to human rights. But two, they come and talk about that look. They claim that sanctions are aimed at taking away resources from countries within authoritarian regimes. They give specific examples like South Africa that look, when you look at South Africa, even when it was removed from such a regime, it is still depending on Western countries in imports and exports. Okay, that's okay. Now we come back and show you that. We look at two things to compare on such an argument. One, actually having resources taken away and also owning resources which you do not actually benefit from, but those very resources are used to harm you and abuse your rights at the end of the day, which we think it is not important. We think that authoritarian regimes actually own resources within governments, but individuals or civilians have got no say on those resources. Those resources are used to harm individuals at the end of the day. So if other individuals or other countries are able to actually sanction these regimes and remove them, but also take some resources, as long as those resources are able to help civilians grow and develop, with what they prove to us, we see that actually the countries they're talking about facing in such a situation have actually gone ahead to develop, which is the aim of the debate at the end of the day. But also, they come and talk about things like Bin Laden, who actually was still ruling at the end of the day. We talk about Iraq and Iran. We think that these countries, their basis for their power, looked at things like trade of nuclear weapons at the end of the day. But sanctions include things like bans on trade or trade embargoes that limit trade of such regimes or of such weapons, which at the end of the day we think weakens such governments and such individuals like Bin Laden at the end of the day, which we think that largely already affects the regime. So we think that what team affirmative does not look at is what the end goal of this all is, but also on what we prove to you that actually brings out the authoritarian regimes weakened at the end of the day, but also complying to international standards. We proved in the first place that look, these individuals or these governments or regimes are not ready to comply to international standards because they're authoritarian. The only way we can deal with them is to impose sanctions. You do not prove to us on how you're going to deal with them without actually imposing sanctions, or without sanctions, they're going to comply. And at the end of the day, we think that team affirmative loses on such points.
And to bring you matter within the third speech that they use this debate. The reason we say that, within their reply, they come up here and they continue to rebut everything else that they missed within the rest of their speech. Which I think that this is problematic, because then it doesn't actually allow us a chance to have the debate at the standard pitch according to the book. Which I think that with this, they come up and they mention many contradictions, and they say that we have contradictions in our case, but they very then concede to the same problems they find in our case. First of all, we think that the problem arises inside opposition case at the point in which they don't understand what an authoritarian regime means. Simply, we see that on our side, we came up here, we characterized it, we told you that this localization of power, there are human rights abuses. First of all, South opposition came up here, they said there's no such thing as human rights abuses. Then they proceeded to say that South Africa was then based on this idea of human rights abuses and sanctions how to see that. First of all, we pointed out that South Africa Africa was not actually an authoritarian regime. Second of all, we pointed out that your idea of what an authoritarian regime does not actually carry over to what your case is. Simply saying that the entire case is based on the idea of sanctions on any country. They don't actually specify to authoritarian regimes. They come up here with the biggest fallacy we've heard within the entire debate, being that the moment you impose sanctions, the authoritarian governments have this responsibility to cater towards their citizens, and they're going to comply with the sanctions. Now, the reason we as side proposition pointed this out as a problem is because as an authoritarian regime, your main goal is to stay in power, and that goal comes first before anything else. So you're not going to cede to sanctions, and we've emphasized this throughout all the books. We actually told you that you're not going to cede to sanctions to the point in which it actually results in you giving up your power as an authoritarian government. We've pointed that out multiple times for the side opposition, but they come up and they proceed to go that they don't understand what is going on in space. Second of all, we recognize a problem when they think that the main goal of sanctions is this idea of compliance to international law. And then they come up and they say there's no such thing as pushing Western agendas, and there's no such thing as geopolitical movements. Now we have a problem with this at the point in which we see that one, if this is the truth, if this is how it works, okay, then why didn't the Western people or any other countries impose sanctions upon China for the human rights abuses occurring? And the reality is they didn't because of the fact that everyone depends on China for many productive items. So we think that the moment you come up and defend this idea of calling out human rights abuses or just calling out the defiance of international law, it's a fallacy at your point because not all countries are called out on it. Like look at the USA. Is there sanctions on USA? No. We actually come up here, we give you a case consistent with arguments, principles, and we actually give you contextualization as well as characterization. They come up here, they give you example after example after example after example after example, and we left looking at ourselves and being like, how did we end up at this point in the debate? At the point in which if you were to strip away the examples, the entire case falls flat. Simply to say that in today's debate, we mentioned how modern times have authoritarian regimes that use loopholes to avoid submission, which then means that the sanctions goal is actually not achieved as a whole because of the fact that there's multiple ways to subvert sanctions, and the reality is within today's society, because of the fact that we mentioned economic alliances like BRICS, which means that Russia doesn't have to cede to the sanctions, which overshadows the sanctions, it means that sanctions are not successful. We see that their debate is only successful in the case in sanctions either weaken the country in the long run or they strengthen it. And we see that either way is harmful. One, when they weaken it in the long run, it leaves the economy crippled a long time after sanctions are ceded, and often it leaves it in a place where which it can't actually catch up to the already developed world. We tell you second of all, under this one, that no matter what the consequences are, they don't care. They just care about ceding to international. We tell you that on their side, to get the benefits, people must suffer and others to contend with the reality. They were literally happy with potentially erasing the entire population just to ensure that compliance with international law was. Second of all, we think within this debate, we gave you an example. We used the principle of equality. We supported it. We said that the arms are not just. The ends do not justify harm. We came up here, we supported it, we gave you managerial effect. They come up here with an example called nothing. That's their principle. They come up here and they say that the long-term for short-term impact is better. We tell you that at the end of the day, the moment the citizens suffer is the moment that the country won't actually be successful, and the moment that no one is allowed to work. We tell you that the economic motives are overshadowed by the geopolitical motives and the bias inherent in them. And that is why we deserve